At 11 minutes past midnight on August 7, 1943, Captain Tamechi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shiga as she steamed north through Vela Gulf in the Solomon Islands. The night was moonless, utterly black. His ship carried no troops tonight, unlike the three destroyers ahead of him, Hagekase, Arashi, and Kawakaze, which were packed with 900 Japanese soldiers and 50 tons of supplies destined for the garrison on Kolombangara. Hara scanned the darkness ahead, searching for any sign of the enemy. He saw nothing. The ocean appeared empty. But Hara felt something wrong deep in his gut. 2 days earlier, at the operational briefing on Rabaul, his superior Captain Kaju Sugiura had announced they would use the exact same route through Vela Gulf that they had used successfully on 3 previous supply runs. Hara had objected immediately. Repeating the same approach was courting disaster. The Americans would be waiting. But his objections were dismissed. Orders were orders. The mission would proceed exactly as planned. Now, as Shiga followed her sister destroyers through the narrow waters between Vela La Vela and Kolombangara, Hara could not shake the conviction that something terrible was about to happen. His training in night combat had been rigorous, years of exercises conducted in complete darkness until Japanese lookouts could spot enemy ships by moonlight or starlight long before any radar could detect them. His torpedoes were the finest in the world, the Type 93 Long Lance, capable of striking targets at ranges the Americans could not even imagine. His ship was fast, maneuverable, commanded by experienced officers and manned by a crew that had survived dozens of combat actions since the war began. He should have felt confident. Instead, he felt exposed. Then, at 23 minutes past midnight, the world exploded. Enormous geysers of water erupted alongside Hagekase and Arashi. The ships burst into flames, their hulls torn open by massive underwater detonations. Kawakaze's forward magazine exploded with such violence that the blast illuminated the entire Gulf for several seconds. In that terrible moment of clarity, Hara understood 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the Americans had detected his force without being seen. Second, they had closed to torpedo range without his lookouts spotting them. Third, the technological advantage that had given Japanese destroyers dominance over Pacific waters for 18 months had just been stripped away. The Americans had learned to fight at night. They had learned to use their radar. And Japanese destroyer commanders would never feel safe in darkness again. Hara survived that night. His ship Shiga was hit by a torpedo that failed to detonate, passing clean through the rudder without exploding. He escaped north toward Rabaul while behind him, 3 destroyers and 1,800 men died in the darkness. Later, when asked to assess the battle, Hara would call it a perfect American victory. What he could not say to preserve the morale of the Japanese fleet, was that the battle revealed a truth more devastating than any torpedo. The Americans were no longer the clumsy, radar-dependent opponents who fumbled through night battles and got themselves slaughtered. They had become predators, efficient and deadly, and Japanese destroyers had become prey. The story of how Japanese destroyer commanders went from confident supremacy to desperate survival reveals one of the most profound psychological shifts of the Pacific War. It was not a shift caused by any single defeat or technological breakthrough. It was a gradual erosion of certainty, a slow recognition that the rules of naval warfare had fundamentally changed, and that the Japanese, despite their superior training and weapons, were on the losing side of that change. In December 1941, Japanese destroyer commanders had every reason for confidence. Their ships were the finest destroyers in the world, designed by naval architects who had pushed beyond the restrictions of international naval treaties to create vessels that combined heavy firepower, exceptional speed, and unprecedented torpedo capability. The Fubuka-class destroyers, introduced in 1928, had shocked Western naval observers with their specifications. These ships displaced over 2,000 tons, far larger than most European or American destroyers of that era. They mounted 6 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets that could elevate to engage aircraft. They carried 9 torpedo tubes loaded with the Type 93 torpedo, a weapon so advanced that American intelligence would not believe reports of its capabilities until well into 1943. The Type 93, called Long Lance by the Americans after the war, was an engineering masterpiece and a tactical revolution. It was propelled by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, which left almost no visible wake. It carried a 1,000-pound warhead, twice the explosive power of American torpedoes. Most importantly, it had an effective range of 22,000 yards at 48 knots, or 40,000 yards at 36 knots. American torpedoes of the same period could barely manage 6,000 yards at 4 to 6 knots. This meant Japanese destroyers could launch devastating torpedo salvos from distances where American commanders did not even believe torpedoes could reach. In the early battles around Guadalcanal, many American officers refused to accept that they had been torpedoed at all. They assumed they had struck mines, because the alternative, that Japanese destroyers could hit them from 10 miles away in total darkness, seemed impossible. Japanese destroyer commanders had also spent years training for night combat with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood that in any major fleet engagement with the United States Navy, American industrial capacity would give the Americans superior numbers. Therefore, Japanese doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, superior training and tactics over mass production. Night fighting became a specialty. Destroyer squadrons practiced complex maneuvers in complete darkness until officers and lookouts could navigate and fight without any artificial illumination. They trained their eyes to adapt to darkness, avoiding bright lights for hours before night operations. They developed hand signals and whispered commands to maintain silence during approaches. They rehearsed coordinated torpedo attacks where multiple destroyers would converge on an enemy formation from different angles, launching volleys of 30 or 40 torpedoes simultaneously, creating an underwater barrage that no enemy fleet could evade. This training paid devastating dividends in the first year of the Pacific War. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, Japanese cruisers and destroyers surprised an American and Australian force protecting the marine landing at Guadalcanal. The Japanese force approached in darkness, closed to point-blank range without being detected, and destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers in less than an hour. American ships exploded and sank so quickly that many sailors never understood what had hit them. The Japanese withdrew with minimal damage. It was one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the United States Navy at sea. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, 8 Japanese destroyers on a supply run to Guadalcanal encountered a superior American force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers. The Americans had radar and numerical superiority. They detected the Japanese first and opened fire at long range. But the Japanese destroyer commanders did what they had been trained to do. They launched their torpedoes while under fire, then turned away at maximum speed to escape. Those torpedoes, launched in the confusion of battle from destroyers that were themselves being hit by American gunfire, struck 4 American cruisers. 1 sank immediately. 3 others were crippled and barely made it back to port. The Japanese lost 1 destroyer and escaped with their mission accomplished. For American commanders, it was humiliating. Their technological advantage in radar had allowed them to see the enemy first and strike first, yet they had still lost the battle. The Japanese torpedoes were simply too good, the Japanese training too thorough, the Japanese confidence too well-founded. Captain Tamechi Hara embodied this elite class of destroyer commanders. Born in 1900 on the island of Shikoku, he had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1921 and risen through the ranks based on demonstrated skill rather than political connections. In 1932, while serving as a surface warfare instructor, Hara wrote the manual on torpedo attack techniques that became official doctrine for the entire Japanese destroyer force. Every destroyer captain in the Imperial Navy used Hara's calculations and tactics. When war came, Hara commanded the destroyer Amatsukes through the early campaigns in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Battle of Midway. He participated in more than a dozen major actions without losing his ship. Later, promoted to captain and given command of Destroyer Division 27, he flew his flag aboard Shiga. Hara was known throughout the fleet for his tactical skill, his aggressive fighting spirit, and his ability to bring his crews home alive through battles that destroyed other ships. He represented everything the Imperial Japanese Navy valued in a commander. And by mid-1943, he was beginning to realize that skill and training and even superior weapons might not be enough. The Americans had advantages that no amount of Japanese training could overcome. American destroyers were being built at a rate that staggered the imagination. The Fletcher-class destroyer program alone would produce 175 ships during the war. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, struggled to replace losses. Every destroyer sunk in combat was a permanent reduction in Japanese strength. Every American destroyer sunk was replaced within months by 3 more. The industrial disparity created a grinding mathematics of attrition that favored the side with more ships, more spare parts, more fuel, more ammunition. Japanese destroyers were forced to operate continuously without adequate maintenance or rest for their crews. Engines that needed overhaul continued running until they broke down in combat. Crews that needed shore leave remained at sea for months on end. The cumulative degradation of Japanese destroyer effectiveness was subtle but relentless. But the most decisive American advantage, the one that would ultimately break the psychological confidence of Japanese destroyer commanders, was radar. American surface search radar, particularly the SG radar that began appearing on destroyers in mid-1943, could detect surface ships at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in darkness or poor visibility. It could differentiate between multiple targets, track their movements, calculate their range and bearing with precision, and allow American commanders to maneuver into attack positions without being seen. Japanese lookouts, no matter how well trained, could not compete with electronic eyes that could see through darkness and identify targets beyond the horizon. And Japanese destroyers carried no effective radar at all. Some ships had primitive sets installed by late 1943, but these were meterband radars that could barely detect large land masses, much less individual ships in the presence of islands. Japanese destroyer commanders, who had spent their entire careers training to fight at night using visual observation and superior tactics, suddenly found themselves at a crippling disadvantage. They could no longer see the enemy first. They could no longer choose when and where to engage. They were fighting blind against an enemy that could see them clearly. The Battle of Vella Gulf demonstrated this new reality with brutal clarity. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger commanded Task Group 31.2, 6 American destroyers assigned to intercept the Tokyo Express run that Hara and his colleagues were making to Kolombangara. Moosbrugger's destroyers were veterans of earlier battles where American tactics had failed. They had learned hard lessons about Japanese torpedoes, Japanese night fighting skill, and the need for new approaches. On the night of August 6 into 7th, Moosbrugger used those lessons to create an ambush that would have been impossible without radar. His destroyers entered Vella Gulf from the south and positioned themselves between the Japanese approach route and the dark mass of Kolombangara Island. The island provided visual concealment. Japanese lookouts scanning ahead would see only the black silhouette of land. But American radar operators could see clearly. At 11:33 that night, radar detected the Japanese force at a range of 10 miles. Moosbrugger maneuvered his ships into attack position with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where his enemy was and knew his enemy could not see him. At 11:56, 3 of Moosbrugger's destroyers, Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, fired 24 torpedoes in 63 seconds. The destroyers then turned sharply and accelerated away, using the island to mask their position. The Japanese had no idea the torpedoes were coming until 30 seconds before impact. By then it was too late. Hagekes, Arashi, and Kawakaze were all struck by multiple torpedoes. The ships burst into flames and began to sink within minutes. The remaining 3 destroyers in Moosbrugger's force, Lang, Sterett, and Stack, closed in and finished off the crippled Japanese ships with gunfire. Hara's Shiga, the only survivor, fired 8 torpedoes while retreating, all of which missed. The entire battle lasted less than 30 minutes. 3 Japanese destroyers sank. 1,800 men died. Not a single American ship was damaged. Not a single American sailor was killed. For Hara, who had seen friends and colleagues die in those flaming wrecks, the battle was a revelation of the worst kind. The Americans had achieved what Japanese destroyer commanders had been trying to do to them for 18 months. They had used superior technology and tactics to achieve complete surprise, deliver a devastating first strike, and withdraw without losses. The roles had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. When Hara returned to Rabaul after the battle, he was asked by his superiors what had caused the disaster. His answer was brutally honest. The Japanese had lost their edge in night combat. American radar had turned night into day for their gunners while leaving the Japanese literally and figuratively in the dark. The superior range of the long-lance torpedo meant nothing if American destroyers could detect Japanese ships, launch their own torpedoes first, and escape before Japanese lookouts even knew they were under attack. And perhaps most troubling, the losses were becoming unsustainable. By the time of Vella Gulf, Japanese destroyer forces in the Solomons campaign had already lost approximately 40 destroyers and 6 cruisers. Those losses could not be replaced. Ships from other fleets were being transferred to maintain operational strength, but these ships had never trained together, had never operated in these waters, had never developed the coordination that effective night combat required. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, just 3 months after Vella Gulf, Japanese destroyers would disable themselves in collisions while trying to dodge American fire. When asked after the war what caused those unusual collisions, the Japanese commander gave an answer that explained everything. Lack of training in night operations. By the time of that battle, they had lost so many experienced destroyer crews that replacement ships reported for duty in the afternoon and were thrown into combat the same night. There was no time for training, no time for crews to learn to work together, no time for the coordination that made Japanese destroyer tactics effective. They were simply feeding ships and men into a meat grinder, desperately trying to maintain supply lines to isolated garrisons that were slowly starving. The psychological impact on surviving commanders like Hara was profound. For 2 years, they had owned the night. They had known with absolute certainty that in any night engagement, Japanese destroyers would outfight American ships. That confidence had allowed them to take risks, to press attacks against superior forces, to believe that skill and training could overcome numerical disadvantage. When radar eliminated that edge, something essential broke. Japanese destroyer commanders became hesitant. They broke off attacks they would have pressed months earlier. They avoided night engagements whenever possible. Some compensated by taking greater risks, closing to shorter ranges before launching torpedoes, pursuing American ships into situations they could not escape. Aggression without superiority meant death. The final demonstration of American mastery in destroyer combat came at the Battle of Cape St. George on November 25, 1943. Captain Ali Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, intercepted a Japanese force of 5 destroyers attempting to reinforce Booker Island. Burke's force detected the Japanese on radar at nearly 22,000 yards, maneuvered into attack position in complete darkness, and launched a coordinated torpedo attack that sank or disabled 3 Japanese destroyers before the Japanese even realized they were under attack. The 4th Japanese destroyer, Ujiri, attempted to fight back but was pursued and destroyed in a running gun battle. The 5th ship, Amajiri, escaped only because Burke's destroyers ran low on fuel and ammunition and had to break off pursuit before daylight brought Japanese aircraft. Not a single American ship was damaged in the battle. Burke later called it an almost perfect action. Coming less than 1 month after Vella Gulf, Cape St. George confirmed that the era of Japanese dominance in night surface combat was over. American destroyer crews had finally mastered their weapons. American commanders had finally developed tactics that exploited their technological advantages. And Japanese destroyer forces, despite their superior training and better torpedoes, could no longer compete. For Hara and the other surviving Japanese destroyer commanders, the battles of late 1943 forced a terrible realization. They were not going to win this war. The Americans had more ships, more resources, more industrial capacity, and now, more effective tactics. Every engagement was a battle of attrition that favored the side with replacement ships waiting in port. Japanese destroyers that survived one battle would be thrown into another within days, without maintenance, without rest, until they were sunk or crippled beyond repair. The Tokyo Express supply runs continued through early 1944, but they were increasingly desperate efforts to sustain isolated garrisons that everyone knew would eventually fall. The best Japanese destroyer commanders, men like Hara who had survived dozens of battles through skill and luck, began to understand that survival itself was becoming the primary objective. Victory was no longer possible. Yet they kept fighting. Japanese military culture did not permit surrender or retreat except under direct orders. Destroyer commanders who saw their fleets being systematically destroyed continued to lead their ships into battle because duty demanded it. They adapted their tactics where possible, developed new techniques to counter American radar, and fought with a stubbornness that took a severe toll on American forces even in defeat. But the psychological shift was irreversible. They had seen the future, and it belonged to the Americans. By mid-1944, Japanese destroyer commanders no longer spoke of victory in the same terms they had used in 1942. Hara's memoirs, published years after the war under the title Japanese Destroyer Captain, revealed the internal discussions that naval officers could never voice publicly during the conflict. Hara wrote with brutal honesty about the failures of Japanese leadership, the miscalculations of strategy, and the technical inferiority that became undeniable as the war progressed. He praised American courage and resourcefulness with a frankness that shocked many Japanese readers when the book appeared in 1958. He acknowledged what many Japanese officers had learned by late 1943 but could never admit. The Americans had become better at destroyer warfare than the Japanese. This admission was devastating precisely because it contradicted everything Japanese naval doctrine had taught. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire tactical philosophy on the assumption of qualitative superiority over numerically superior enemies. Individual Japanese ships were supposed to be better than individual American ships. Japanese crews were supposed to be better trained. Japanese officers were supposed to make better tactical decisions. When those assumptions proved false, the entire structure of Japanese confidence collapsed. What replaced it was not despair, not surrender, but a grim determination to inflict maximum damage before the inevitable defeat. Japanese destroyer commanders stopped thinking about winning the war and started thinking about how to make the Americans pay the highest possible price for victory. The material disparity grew worse with each passing month. By 1944, American shipyards were launching Fletcher-class destroyers at a rate that staggered comprehension. Between June 1942 and February 1945, American yards commissioned 175 Fletcher-class destroyers. That was more destroyers of a single class than the entire Japanese destroyer force at the beginning of the war. The Fletchers displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded, mounted 5 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets, carried 10 torpedo tubes, and could make 37 knots. They were equipped with the SG surface search radar that had proven so deadly at Vella Gulf and Cape St. George. They had modern fire control systems that allowed accurate gunnery at night. And most importantly, there were so many of them that losing one or two in combat barely registered in American operational planning. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, struggled to replace losses. By mid-1944, Japan had lost approximately 100 destroyers since the war began. The shipbuilding industry could not match American production rates. Yards that should have been building new destroyers were repairing damaged ones. Resources that should have been allocated to warship construction were diverted to merchant shipping, desperately trying to maintain supply lines to the far-flung territories of the Japanese Empire. Every destroyer sunk in the Solomons campaign or the Central Pacific or off the coast of the Philippines represented a permanent reduction in Japanese naval strength. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses faster than the enemy could sink ships. The Americans could. The Japanese could not. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, demonstrated how completely the tactical situation had reversed. Vice Admiral Sentaro Omori commanded a Japanese force of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers sent to attack American landing forces at Bougainville. Omori had superior firepower, heavier ships, and commanders who had been training for night combat for decades. What he did not have was effective radar or coordinated tactics suitable for fighting an enemy who could see in the dark. The Americans, under Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill, detected Omori's force on radar at 2:27 in the morning from a range of more than 10 miles. Merrill positioned his 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers to intercept while the Japanese remained unaware of American positions. When the battle began, Japanese formation cohesion collapsed almost immediately. The light cruiser Sendai, flagship of Rear Admiral Matsuji Ijuin, came under concentrated fire from American cruisers and was crippled within minutes. 2 destroyers, Samide and Shiratsuyu, collided while trying to evade American shells. The destroyer Hatsukes, attempting to avoid gunfire in the darkness, turned directly into the path of the heavy cruiser Myoko and was cut in half by the collision. Myoko herself suffered damage when the wreckage of Hatsukes scraped along her port side. The Japanese force, which had entered the battle with clear numerical and firepower superiority, inflicted minimal damage on the Americans while suffering catastrophic losses. Sendai sank. Hatsuke's sank. Multiple other Japanese ships were damaged. Not a single American ship was lost. When Omori was asked after the battle what had gone wrong, his answer was simple and damning. The Japanese had lost control of the engagement from the moment American radar detected them. Japanese lookouts, straining to see through the darkness, could not locate American ships until shells were already falling around them. Japanese commanders, unable to determine enemy positions, maneuvered blindly and collided with their own ships. The superior training and tactics that had won victories at Savo Island and Tassafaronga meant nothing when the Japanese could not see the enemy and the enemy could see them perfectly. Omori was relieved of command. The defeat at Empress Augusta Bay marked the end of Japanese attempts to contest American landings with major surface forces in the Solomons. Hara, who had not participated in that particular disaster but had witnessed similar debacles, wrote in his memoirs that the collisions were not accidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem. Japanese destroyer forces by late 1943 were being thrown into combat with minimal training because there was no time for the intensive preparation that had characterized pre-war readiness. Ships that had never operated together were assembled into task forces in the afternoon and sent into battle the same night. Crews that had been decimated in previous actions were filled with inexperienced replacements who had never trained in coordinated maneuvers. The result was chaos. Commanders who could not see the enemy collided with their own ships while trying to avoid shells fired from unknown directions. The darkness that had once been Japan's ally became an environment of confusion and terror. The Americans, meanwhile, had developed standardized tactics specifically designed to exploit radar advantages. Destroyer divisions trained together for months before deployment. Radar operators practiced tracking multiple targets simultaneously until they could differentiate between friendly and enemy ships at a glance. Gunnery officers rehearsed radar-controlled fire until they could hit targets they could not see with accuracy that approached daytime conditions. Captain Ali Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, became famous throughout the Pacific Fleet for his aggressive tactics and his ability to use radar to achieve surprise. His destroyers operated as a coordinated unit, maneuvering at high speed in darkness with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going and exactly where the enemy was located. Japanese destroyer commanders, who had once been the masters of night combat, watched in frustration as American destroyers executed maneuvers that would have been impossible without electronic assistance. By 1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had shifted from aggressive night attacks to defensive maneuvering designed to minimize losses. Destroyer commanders who once would have pressed attacks against superior forces now broke off engagements when radar contact indicated American presence. The famous Long Lance torpedo, which could strike at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, became less effective as American radar allowed destroyers to detect torpedo wakes and maneuver to avoid them. Japanese destroyers, forced to close to shorter ranges to ensure hits, found themselves within range of American guns and torpedoes. The tactical revolution that radar represented had eliminated the one decisive advantage Japanese destroyers possessed. Range meant nothing when the enemy could see you coming from 10 miles away. The human cost of this transformation was staggering. Of the 175 destroyers the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at the beginning of World War II, 129 were sunk during the conflict. That represents a loss rate of 73%. Most destroyer captains who began the war in command did not survive to see its end. Hara was an exception. He survived more than 100 combat sorties and became known throughout Japan as the unsinkable captain. But even Hara recognized that survival was primarily a matter of luck rather than skill. He had been in situations where radar-equipped American forces should have destroyed his ship. He had escaped through fortune, not superior tactics. Every battle was a reminder that the next engagement might be his last. The psychological burden on Japanese destroyer commanders intensified as the war progressed into 1945. They were being asked to execute missions that everyone knew were suicidal. The Tokyo Express supply runs, which had sustained isolated garrisons throughout the Solomons campaign, continued into the final year of the war even though success rates had fallen to near zero. Destroyers loaded with troops and supplies would race through contested waters at night, hoping to reach their destination before American aircraft or ships intercepted them. Most never made it. The survivors would offload whatever supplies remained and race back toward friendly territory before daylight brought American air attacks. The crews called it the Rat Run, a desperate scramble through enemy-controlled waters with little hope of survival. Commanders who led these missions knew they were sending their men to almost certain death. They did it anyway because orders demanded it and military culture provided no alternative. In his memoirs, Hara described the final months of the war with a detachment that barely concealed his bitterness. He had been transferred from destroyer command to serve as an instructor at the Naval Torpedo School, teaching tactics to officers who would likely die before they could apply what they learned. He watched as the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once been the third most powerful fleet in the world, was systematically destroyed by an enemy that had learned to fight better than the Japanese themselves. The destroyers that survived combat were sunk by aircraft or submarines or simply ran out of fuel and were scuttled by their own crews. The industrial base that should have been producing replacement ships was being bombed into rubble by American B-29s. The training infrastructure that should have been producing new officers and crews was collapsing as experienced instructors were pulled back into combat duty to fill gaps in the fleet. Everything was falling apart, and everyone knew it. But the war continued because surrender was unthinkable until the Emperor himself ordered it. In April 1945, Hara was given command of the light cruiser Yahaji and assigned to Operation Tengo, the final sortie of the battleship Yamato. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was to sail to Okinawa with Yahaji and 8 destroyers in a one-way mission. The force carried only enough fuel for a single transit to Okinawa. The plan was to beach Yamato on the invasion beaches and use her massive 18-inch guns as a stationary fortress to destroy American landing craft and ships. Everyone involved understood this was a suicide mission disguised as a combat operation. There was no possibility of success, no hope of returning, no tactical objective beyond dying in a manner that military leadership considered honorable. Hara objected to the operation. He argued that throwing away Japan's last major surface ships would achieve nothing except the deaths of thousands of sailors. His objections were ignored. Orders were orders. On April 6, 1945, the Yamato force departed Japan for Okinawa. The next day, they were attacked by nearly 400 American aircraft from multiple aircraft carriers. The air attacks began in the early afternoon and continued for hours. Yahaji was struck by multiple torpedoes and bombs. Her engine rooms flooded. Fires broke out throughout the ship. Hara ordered the crew to abandon ship shortly before she capsized and sank. He survived, pulled from the water by a destroyer that rescued him and other survivors. Yamato herself was struck by dozens of torpedoes and bombs and sank in the afternoon, taking most of her crew with her. Of the 10 ships that had departed Japan the day before, only 4 destroyers made it back to port. The operation accomplished nothing except proving that surface ships, no matter how powerful, could not survive against massed air attacks. The American Navy had not even needed to commit destroyers to defeat the Japanese force. Aircraft alone had been sufficient. Hara's survival of Operation Tengo was his final stroke of luck in a war that had claimed nearly all his colleagues. He spent the remaining months of the war ashore, watching as American forces bombed Japanese cities and prepared for an invasion that never came because atomic weapons ended the conflict in August 1945. After Japan's surrender, Hara commanded merchant ships, transporting goods in the post-war reconstruction. He never returned to naval service. In the 1950s, he began writing his memoirs, trying to make sense of a war that had destroyed everything he had fought to protect. Japanese Destroyer Captain was published in 1958 in Japan and translated into English in 1961. It became one of the most important first-hand accounts of the Pacific War from the Japanese perspective, valued by historians for its honesty and detailed tactical analysis. In his memoir, Hara paid tribute to American courage and effectiveness. He wrote about American destroyers with a respect that bordered on admiration. He acknowledged that American commanders had learned to use their technological advantages with skill and determination. He described American sailors as brave men who fought with the same dedication as Japanese crews. This was remarkable given the hatred and racism that had characterized much of the Pacific War. Hara's willingness to praise his former enemies demonstrated a maturity and objectivity rare in military memoirs written so soon after conflict. He was not trying to excuse Japanese defeats or blame others for failures. He was trying to explain what had actually happened, using his own experiences as evidence. What Hara revealed in his memoir was the story of a psychological transformation that mirrored the material transformation of the war. Japanese destroyer commanders had begun the conflict confident in their superiority, certain that training and tactics and superior weapons would overcome American numerical advantages. They had ended the war knowing they had been wrong. American destroyers, equipped with radar and crewed by sailors who had learned from early defeats, had become the dominant force in Pacific night combat. The long-lance torpedo and elite training and decades of night fighting exercises had not been enough. Technology had shifted the balance, and the side with more ships and better industrial capacity had learned to use that technology effectively. The Japanese had owned the night in 1942. By 1944, the Americans owned it completely. By 1945, there were almost no Japanese destroyers left to contest American dominance. The final count tells the story more clearly than any tactical analysis. Of 175 Japanese destroyers at the start of the war, 129 were sunk. Of the 46 that survived to August 1945, most were obsolete or damaged beyond repair. The United States Navy, by contrast, commissioned 175 Fletcher-class destroyers alone, plus dozens of other destroyer classes, during the same period. The industrial disparity that Hara had recognized early in the war had proven decisive. American shipyards built destroyers faster than Japanese submarines and aircraft and ships could sink them. Every American destroyer lost was replaced by 3 more within months. Every Japanese destroyer lost was gone forever. But the numbers do not capture the psychological impact of this transformation. Japanese destroyer commanders who had spent their entire careers training to be the best night fighters in the world had to accept that they had lost that edge to an enemy who compensated for inferior training with superior technology and industrial capacity. That acceptance was devastating. It meant admitting that individual skill and decades of tradition meant less than radar screens and mass production. It meant recognizing that the war had always been unwinnable, that Japan's initial victories had been temporary advantages exploited by commanders who did not understand the full scope of American potential. It meant living with the knowledge that thousands of men had died in battles that accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. Hara's final assessment of the Pacific War, written years after the conflict ended, was both bitter and honest. He believed Japanese leadership had been incompetent, that strategic decisions had been made by officers more concerned with preserving their own positions than winning battles. He believed the decision to go to war with the United States had been a catastrophic miscalculation based on underestimating American industrial capacity and willingness to fight. He believed that Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on unquestioning obedience and its prohibition against retreat, had caused unnecessary deaths. But he also believed that individual Japanese sailors and officers had fought with courage and determination worthy of respect. They had not lost because they were cowards or because they lacked skill. They had lost because they were fighting an enemy with advantages that skill alone could not overcome. American destroyer commanders after the war would echo similar assessments. They respected Japanese destroyer crews and acknowledged that early in the war, Japanese tactics and weapons had been superior. But they also knew that by mid-1943, American forces had developed tactics and technologies that neutralized Japanese advantages. Radar had been the decisive factor. The SG surface search radar, installed on destroyers starting in early 1943, allowed American ships to detect Japanese forces at ranges where Japanese lookouts could see nothing. This single technological advantage, combined with aggressive commanders willing to exploit it, had transformed American destroyers from victims at Savo Island and Tassafaronga into victors at Vella Gulf and Cape St. George. Japanese destroyer commanders never developed an effective counter. Some ships were equipped with primitive radar by late 1943, but these sets were inferior to American equipment and Japanese operators lacked training in their use. By the time Japanese forces began to understand how crucial radar had become, it was too late to close the gap. The story of Japanese destroyer commanders in World War II is not a story of incompetence or cowardice. It is a story of highly skilled professionals who trained for decades to master a specific type of warfare, only to discover that their skills had become obsolete. The night fighting techniques that made Japanese destroyers dominant in 1942 were useless against radar-equipped American ships in 1943. The long-lance torpedo that could strike at unprecedented ranges meant nothing when American destroyers could see the launch and maneuver to avoid. The elite training and superior tactics that characterized Japanese destroyer forces could not compensate for industrial disparity that allowed Americans to replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Japanese destroyer commanders fought with courage and skill throughout the war. But by mid-1943, they were fighting a losing battle against enemies who had learned to fight better and who possessed resources that Japan could never match. The transformation was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. The masters of night combat had become prey for American destroyers equipped with radar and crewed by sailors who had learned hard lessons in blood. And Japanese destroyer commanders like Tamechi Hara, who survived when most of their colleagues died, were left to write memoirs that explained how and why it happened. Their testimony remains one of the most valuable sources for understanding the Pacific War, precisely because they were willing to admit what many on the losing side could not. They had been outfought, outsmarted, and overwhelmed by an enemy they had underestimated. If you found this exploration of one of World War II's most profound psychological shifts compelling, consider learning more about the personal accounts that shaped our understanding of the Pacific War, and how individual experiences reveal the larger truths of history.